In the final decade of the 15th century, the Eastern Hemisphere stood at a crossroads between medieval isolation and global interconnection. Europe, recovering from the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death that had killed perhaps half its population a century earlier, was experiencing what historians would later call the birth of the modern world. Multiple factors converged to make transoceanic exploration not just possible, but imperative. The intellectual foundation for expansion was laid during the Renaissance, which began in Italian city-states and spread northward. This cultural rebirth was not merely artistic. It represented a fundamental shift in how Europeans understood their place in the universe. Humanism emphasized human agency and potential. The rediscovery of classical texts, particularly Ptolemy's geography, translated into Latin in 1406, reintroduced the concept that the Earth was spherical and could be mapped mathematically. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 facilitated the rapid dissemination of these ideas. Simultaneously, maritime technology underwent revolutionary improvements. The caravel developed by the Portuguese combined square sails, good for running before the wind, with triangular lateen sails, allowing sailing closer to the wind, creating a vessel capable of oceanic exploration. Navigational instruments like the astrolabe and cross-staff allowed sailors to determine latitude by measuring the angle of celestial bodies. The magnetic compass, known in Europe since the 12th century, became standard equipment. Port-o-land charts provided increasingly accurate coastal maps. Perhaps the most immediate catalyst for exploration was economic. Since Roman times, Europe had coveted Asian goods, spices, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, to preserve and flavor food, silk for clothing, porcelain for dining, and drugs like opium. These goods traveled along the Silk Road, a network of overland routes through Central Asia. However, the rise of the Ottoman Empire fundamentally disrupted this trade. When Mehmed II captured Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans gained control of the critical choke point between Europe and Asia. They imposed heavy tariffs on goods passing through their territory, making Asian products prohibitively expensive in Europe. Portugal, under the visionary leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, 1394 to 1460, pioneered an alternative route around Africa. Henry established a navigation school at Sagres and sponsored expeditions down the West African coast. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving Africa could be circumnavigated. This set the stage for Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1497 to 1499, which would open direct sea trade with Asia. Spain, meanwhile, was completing the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. In January 1492, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. This victory united Spain under Catholic rule and freed up resources for external ventures. It also created a militant Catholic ideology that would profoundly influence Spain's approach to colonization. Into this world stepped Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator of controversial background and unshakable conviction. Columbus had developed a theory, based on miscalculations from Ptolemy and Marco Polo's writings, that Asia lay only about 4,000 kilometers west of Europe across the Atlantic. After failing to secure Portuguese backing, he spent 7 years at the Spanish court, finally winning support from Isabella in April 1492, just months after Granada's fall. The capitulations of Santa Fe granted Columbus the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of any lands discovered, and 10% of all wealth obtained. Thus, on August 3, 1492, Columbus departed Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the flagship, Pinta and Niña, and approximately 90 men. His voyage would initiate one of the most consequential collisions of worlds in human history, setting in motion processes that would reshape global ecology, demography, economics, and politics for centuries to come. The voyage and initial contact. The transatlantic crossing took longer than Columbus anticipated, over 2 months of increasingly anxious sailing. By early October, with the crew nearing mutiny, land was sighted at 2 a.m. on October 12th by a lookout on the Pinta. The island, called Guanahani by its inhabitants, likely in the Bahamas, possibly San Salvador or Samana Cay, was inhabited by the Taíno people, part of the broader Arawakan linguistic family that populated the Greater Antilles. Columbus's journal entries from these first days reveal his immediate impressions and intentions. He described the Taíno as naked as the day they were born, with very handsome bodies and very fine faces. He noted their apparent technological simplicity. They have no iron or steel or weapons, nor are they capable of using them, although they are well-built people of handsome stature. Crucially, he observed, they should be good servants and very intelligent, for I have observed that they quickly repeat everything said to them. From the outset, Columbus perceived the indigenous people not as equals, but as potential converts and laborers. Over the next 3 months, Columbus explored several Caribbean islands, including Cuba, which he initially believed to be China, and Hispaniola, modern Haiti and Dominican Republic, which he thought might be Japan. He established a small settlement called La Navidad on Hispaniola's north coast, leaving 39 men behind when he returned to Spain in January 1493. The second voyage, colonization, begins in earnest. Columbus's return to Spain in March 1493 created a sensation. He presented Ferdinand and Isabella with captured Taínos, gold trinkets, exotic birds, and tantalizing descriptions of potential wealth. The monarchs immediately organized a second, much larger expedition, 17 ships carrying approximately 1,200 men, soldiers, colonists, priests, and craftsmen, along with livestock, seeds, agricultural tools, and a sinister innovation: war dogs, particularly mastiffs and greyhounds, trained to attack and terrify indigenous peoples. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola in November 1493, he found La Navidad destroyed and all settlers killed, likely in retaliation for their abusive behavior toward Taíno women and communities. Undeterred, he established a new settlement named Isabella, which quickly became a death trap due to poor location, inadequate supplies, and tropical diseases. The Spanish relationship with the Taíno deteriorated rapidly as demands for gold and food increased, the encomienda system, and demographic catastrophe. To organize labor and reward followers, Columbus implemented a system that would become institutionalized as the encomienda. Spanish settlers, encomenderos, were granted trusteeship over groups of indigenous people who were compelled to provide tribute in gold, agricultural products, and labor. In theory, encomenderos were responsible for protecting their charges and converting them to Christianity. In practice, it became a system of forced labor, little different from slavery. The Taíno, with no immunity to European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, began dying in catastrophic numbers. Combined with brutal treatment, beatings, mutilations, and outright massacres, the demographic collapse was staggering. Estimates of the pre-contact population of Hispaniola range from 300,000 to over 1 million. By 1514, a census recorded only about 30,000 Taíno. By 1542, fewer than 1,000 remained. Similar patterns unfolded throughout the Caribbean. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrived in 1502 and initially participated in the system before becoming its most famous critic, documented these atrocities in his brief account of the destruction of the Indies, 1542. He described Spanish soldiers testing their swords on indigenous people by cutting them in half with a single blow, placing bets on who could cleave a person most efficiently, and feeding babies to war dogs. While Las Casas likely exaggerated for rhetorical effect, archaeological and documentary evidence confirms extreme violence and population collapse. The Treaty of Tordesillas and Portugal's entry news of Columbus's discoveries alarmed Portugal, which feared Spanish intrusion into what it considered its sphere of influence under earlier papal bulls. Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard, Rodrigo Borgia, issued a series of bulls in 1493 establishing a line of demarcation 100 leagues west of the Azores. Portuguese King John II, dissatisfied with this arrangement, negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas 1494, moving the line 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. This arbitrary division gave Spain claim to most of the Americas, but placed part of South America's eastern bulge in the Portuguese zone, a fact whose significance would only become apparent later. Portugal's primary focus remained the African route to Asia. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India, 1497 to 1499, confirmed this strategy's viability. However, in 1500, Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral, leading a fleet to India, was blown off course and made landfall on the Brazilian coast. Recognizing this territory lay east of the Tordesillas line, he claimed it for Portugal. Initial Portuguese interest was minimal. They established temporary trading posts, feitorias, to harvest pau-brasil, Brazil wood, which produced a valuable red dye. Unlike the Spanish, the Portuguese initially sought trade rather than conquest, though relations with the Tupinamba and other indigenous groups were frequently violent. The fall of the Aztec Empire. By 1519, Spanish settlement in the Caribbean, while devastating to indigenous populations, had yielded disappointing quantities of gold. Rumors persisted of wealthy civilizations on the mainland. That year, Hernán Cortés, an ambitious and ruthless Spaniard stationed in Cuba, organized an expedition to Mexico, defying orders from his superior, Governor Diego Velázquez. Cortés's expedition comprised about 600 men, 16 horses, several pieces of artillery, and a few hundred indigenous allies from Cuba. They landed on the Yucatan coast in February 1519, where they first encountered the Maya. At Potonchan, they fought a battle that demonstrated Spanish military superiority. More importantly, they acquired an interpreter, a Nahua woman known as Malinche, Doña Marina, who spoke both Maya and Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and would become Cortés's mistress, advisor, and crucial cultural intermediary. As Cortés moved inland, he learned of the powerful Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, more accurately, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, leading the Triple Alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, dominated central Mexico through military might and a sophisticated tribute system. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, built on islands in Lake Texcoco, astonished the Spanish with its size, perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, larger than any European city except possibly Constantinople. Cleanliness and architectural sophistication, including aqueducts, causeways, and magnificent temples. Cortés skillfully exploited existing political tensions. Many subject peoples resented Aztec domination and the constant demand for tribute, including captives for religious sacrifice. The Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of the Aztecs, after initially fighting the Spanish, became crucial allies. When Cortés reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, Emperor Moctezuma II received him with elaborate ceremony, possibly believing the Spanish might be representatives of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, whose return was prophesied. Tensions escalated when Cortés took Moctezuma hostage, using him as a puppet ruler. Meanwhile, a Spanish force from Cuba arrived to arrest Cortés for insubordination. Cortés defeated them and incorporated their soldiers into his army, but during his absence from Tenochtitlan, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado massacred Aztec nobility during the Toxcatl festival, provoking a full-scale uprising. The Spanish were driven from the city on La Noche Triste, The Night of Sorrows, June the 30th, 1520, suffering heavy losses as they fled across the causeways. The Spanish returned in 1521 with thousands of indigenous allies and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. The defenders were weakened by smallpox, which had broken out in 1520, killing perhaps a third of the population, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac. After 93 days, the city fell on August 13, 1521. The conquest was extraordinarily brutal. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortez's army, later wrote that the lake water was so filled with bodies and blood that one could not walk except on corpses. The conquest of the Inca Empire. News of Mexican wealth inspired other conquistadors. Francisco Pizarro, an illiterate former swineherd who had accompanied Balboa, organized an expedition to Peru after hearing rumors of a wealthy empire to the south. His first attempts in 1524 and 1526 failed, but in 1532, with about 168 men and 62 horses, he entered the heart of the Inca Empire at precisely its most vulnerable moment. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, was the largest pre-Columbian empire, stretching along the Andes from modern Colombia to Chile, connected by an extensive road system. In 1527, Emperor Huayna Capac died, probably from smallpox that had spread south from Spanish contacts. His death triggered a civil war between his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa. Atahualpa emerged victorious in 1532, but his forces were depleted, and the empire was politically fractured. Pizarro invited Atahualpa to a meeting at Cajamarca on November 16, 1532. The emperor arrived with several thousand unarmed retainers in a display of majesty. A Spanish friar presented him with a Bible and demanded he accept Christianity and Spanish sovereignty. When Atahualpa threw the Bible to the ground, the Spanish launched a surprise attack, slaughtering thousands and capturing the emperor. Atahualpa offered a famous ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver, which was paid over several months, but he was executed anyway in July 1533 after a sham trial. The Spanish captured the capital Cusco in November 1533. Resistance continued for decades, most notably the Neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba until 1572, but Spanish control of the empire's heartland was established. The conquest was facilitated not only by technology, steel, horses, firearms, and disease, but also by indigenous alliances. Many peoples subjugated by the Inca welcomed the Spanish as liberators, only to find themselves under a far more oppressive regime. The colonial administration system. The Spanish crown moved quickly to establish control over these conquests and prevent the rise of independent feudal lords. The laws of Burgos, 1512, and later the New Laws, 1542, attempted with limited success to regulate treatment of indigenous people. The encomienda system became formalized, though it was supposed to replace outright slavery with a more regulated form of tribute and labor obligation. Two major administrative units were created: the Viceroyalty of New Spain, 1535, covering Mexico, Central America, and eventually the Philippines, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, 1542, covering South America except Brazil. Within these, audiencias, high courts, and municipal councils, cabildos, provided layers of administration. The Catholic Church played a central role, both in conversion efforts, often forcibly, and in recording indigenous cultures. Missionaries like Bernardino de Sahagún meticulously documented Nahuatl language and culture in his 12-volume Florentine Codex, even while working to supplant indigenous religion with Christianity. The economic engine of Spanish America became silver mining, particularly at Potosí, in modern Bolivia, discovered 1545, and Zacatecas, Mexico, discovered 1546. The introduction of the mercury amalgamation process in the 1550s dramatically increased yields. Potosí became one of the largest cities in the world, with a population exceeding 150,000 by 1600. The silver flowed to Spain via annual treasure fleets, fueling European inflation, the price revolution, and trade with Asia, while creating immense wealth for a small elite and unimaginable suffering for the indigenous and African laborers in the mines. France's early explorations and setbacks. France, emerging from the Hundred Years' War and Italian Wars, entered the colonial race under Francis I, r. 1515 to 1547. In 1524, he commissioned the Florentine Giovanni da Verrazzano to explore the North American coast between Florida and Newfoundland, seeking a northwest passage to Asia. Verrazzano produced valuable maps, coining the term New France, but found no passage. A decade later, Jacques Cartier made 3 voyages, 1534, 1535 to 36, 1541 to 42. On his second voyage, he ascended the St. Lawrence River to the Iroquoian village of Hochelaga, Montreal, and learned from natives of a rich kingdom called Saguenay. Cartier's reports inspired the establishment of Charlesbourg Royal in 1541 under Jean-François de la Roque de Roberval, but the settlement failed due to harsh winters, scurvy, which the French learned to treat with a vitamin C-rich evergreen tea from the Iroquois, and hostile relations with the Stadaconans. These early failures revealed a pattern. France lacked the sustained commitment for agricultural colonization, focusing instead on finding quick mineral wealth or a passage to Asia. Religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots, Protestants, further diverted attention. Nevertheless, French fishermen were increasingly active on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, establishing seasonal settlements for processing cod, a valuable source of protein for Catholic Europe. England's tentative beginnings and learning curve. England's involvement began with John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, a Venetian sponsored by Henry VII, who reached Newfoundland in 1497. However, England showed little sustained interest for decades, being preoccupied with domestic politics and separation from the Catholic Church. Under Elizabeth I, ruler 1558 to 1603, English maritime activity increased dramatically, driven by anti-Spanish sentiment, Protestant nationalism, and economic need. Sea dogs, like John Hawkins and Francis Drake, engaged in smuggling, privateering, and the early slave trade. Drake's circumnavigation, 1577 to 1580, which included plundering Spanish ports on the Pacific coast, demonstrated both English capability and audacity. The first serious English colonization attempt was Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke venture. In 1585, Raleigh sent about 100 men under Ralph Lane to establish a fort on Roanoke Island, North Carolina. The colony struggled with food shortages and hostile relations with the Secatan people. When Sir Francis Drake stopped there in 1586 after raiding Spanish colonies, the desperate colonists abandoned the settlement. A second group, including women and children, arrived in 1587 under John White. Soon after establishing themselves, White returned to England for supplies. His return was delayed by the Spanish Armada crisis, 1588. When he finally reached Roanoke in 1590, he found the settlement deserted with only the cryptic word Croatoan carved on a post. The fate of the lost colony remains one of America's enduring mysteries. Likely some colonists were absorbed into nearby indigenous communities, while others may have perished. The Dutch commercial empire emerges. The Dutch, fighting for independence from Spain since 1568, developed exceptional commercial and maritime skills. By the 1590s, Dutch merchants were dominating the European carrying trade. In 1602, they established the Dutch East India Company, VOC, a revolutionary joint stock corporation with quasi-governmental powers. It could wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and administer justice. In North America, their involvement began when Henry Hudson, an Englishman employed by the Dutch East India Company, explored the river that bears his name in 1609, seeking a northwest passage. His favorable reports of fur trading potential led to the establishment of New Netherland. The Dutch West India Company, WIC, founded in 1621, was granted a monopoly on trade and colonization in the Americas. Unlike Spanish and early English efforts, Dutch colonization was unapologetically commercial from the start. The English Chesapeake, tobacco and indentured servitude. The English learned from Roanoke's failure. The key innovation was the joint stock company, which pooled capital from multiple investors, spreading risk. The Virginia Company of London received a charter in 1606 and established Jamestown on May 14, 1607, in the Chesapeake Bay region. Jamestown's early years were disastrous. The site was swampy and malaria-ridden. The colonists, many of them gentlemen unaccustomed to manual labor, searched vainly for gold instead of planting crops. During the starving time winter of 1609-10, of approximately 500 colonists, only about 60 survived, resorting to cannibalism. The leadership of Captain John Smith, who imposed discipline, "He that will not work shall not eat," and established trade with the Powhatan Confederacy, was crucial, as was the arrival of new settlers and supplies. The colony's salvation was tobacco. John Rolfe experimented with West Indian strains, producing a leaf that appealed to European tastes. By 1617, Virginia was exporting 20,000 pounds of tobacco. By 1628, over 500,000 pounds. This created an insatiable demand for land and labor. The headright system granted 50 acres for each person transported, encouraging the importation of indentured servants, poor Englishmen and women who exchanged 4 to 7 years of labor for passage and eventual freedom. Relations with the Powhatan deteriorated as tobacco plantations expanded. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609 to 1614, ended with the marriage of John Rolfe to Pocahontas, Matoaka, daughter of paramount chief Wahun Senakau, but this peace was fragile. On March the 22nd, 1622, Opechancanough, Wahun Senakau's brother and successor, launched a coordinated attack that killed 347 colonists, about a quarter of Virginia's population. The English response was genocidal. They systematically destroyed Powhatan villages and food supplies. A second attack in 1644 killed about 500 colonists, but resulted in Opechancanoug's capture and execution, effectively ending Powhatan power. New England, a city upon a hill, north of Virginia, a very different English society emerged. The Pilgrims, separatists who rejected the Church of England, established Plymouth Colony in 1620. Their Mayflower Compact established a precedent for self-government. A larger Puritan migration, led by the Massachusetts Bay Company, chartered 1629, brought about 20,000 people to New England in the 1630s. Unlike Virginia, New England attracted families seeking religious community rather than individual economic opportunity. John Winthrop's sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, articulated the vision of Massachusetts Bay as a city upon a hill, a beacon of Reformed Protestantism. New England's economy was based on mixed farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade rather than plantation agriculture. The region's rocky soil and colder climate made large-scale staple crop agriculture impractical. Instead, New Englanders developed a diverse economy, subsistence farming supplemented by livestock, timber exports, fishing, particularly cod, and shipbuilding. The region's many rivers provided water power for mills. Socially, New England was more homogeneous and egalitarian than the Chesapeake, at least among white settlers. Towns were organized around congregations, with land distributed fairly equally among households. However, this communalism had a dark side. Religious dissent was not tolerated. Roger Williams, who argued for separation of church and state and fair treatment of Native Americans, was banished in 1636 and founded Rhode Island as a haven for religious freedom. Anne Hutchinson, who challenged clerical authority, was exiled in 1638. New France, the fur trade empire. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec on July 3, 1608, as a fortified trading post. New France's economy centered on the fur trade, particularly beaver pelts used for felt hats in Europe. This dictated a different colonial model. Instead of displacing indigenous populations, the French needed them as hunting partners and allies. Champlain cemented an alliance with the Huron, Wendat, and Algonquin peoples against their mutual enemies, the Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, beginning a conflict that would span decades. The French colonial population grew slowly. The Company of New France, founded 1627, struggled to attract settlers. Society was organized under the seigneurial system, with large land grants given to seigneurs who rented to habitants. By 1663, when Louis XIV made New France a royal province, the population was only about 3,000. The king sent over the Carignan-Salière regiment to confront the Iroquois and implemented policies to boost population, including sending filles du roi, approximately 800 young women, to become wives for settlers. By 1680, the population reached about 10,000, still tiny compared to English colonies. French Jesuit missionaries played a unique role. Unlike Spanish friars, who often forced conversion, Jesuits like Jean de Brébeuf learned indigenous languages and attempted to understand cultures before converting. They produced invaluable ethnographic records, though their ultimate goal remained assimilation to Catholicism and French culture. Their relations with indigenous peoples were complex. Some saw them as spiritual guides, others as dangerous sorcerers. The Caribbean, the Sugar Revolution. While English and French established footholds in North America, the Caribbean became the most economically valuable colonial zone. The Spanish had focused on the Greater Antilles, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, but after 1600, other powers colonized the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles. The English settled Barbados in 1627, St. Kitts in 1623, Nevis in 1628, and Antigua in 1632. The French occupied Martinique and Guadeloupe in 1635. Initially, these colonies produced tobacco, cotton, and indigo using white indentured labor. But in the 1640s, Barbados planters began large-scale sugar cultivation, transforming the Caribbean completely. Sugar was a rich man's crop, requiring substantial capital for mills, boiling houses, and labor. The solution was enslaved Africans. The mortality rate was horrific. On Barbados sugar plantations, approximately 1/3 of newly arrived Africans died within 3 years, but profits were astronomical. A successful sugar plantation could yield returns of 10% annually. By the 1680s, Barbados was the wealthiest colony in English America, with a sugar-based economy entirely dependent on slavery. The transition from indentured to enslaved labor had profound social consequences. In the early decades, white servants and black slaves often worked together and sometimes rebelled together, as in Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, 1676. To prevent such solidarity, colonial legislatures began enacting slave codes that legally distinguished between races, making slavery hereditary and based on African descent. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 became a model for other colonies, defining slaves as property and giving masters absolute authority. The Middle Colonies, pluralism and promise. Between Puritan New England and the plantation South emerged diverse middle colonies. New Netherland, with its capital at New Amsterdam, founded 1624, was the most cosmopolitan. The Dutch West India Company encouraged immigration from across Europe, resulting in a population that included Dutch, Walloons, French Huguenots, Scandinavians, Germans, Portuguese Jews, and Africans, both enslaved and free. The colony's focus was commerce, not religious uniformity. English encroachment on Dutch territory led to conflict. In 1664, an English fleet under Colonel Richard Nichols demanded New Amsterdam's surrender. Governor Peter Stuyvesant, with inadequate defences and little popular support, capitulated. New Netherland became New York, named for the Duke of York, future James II. The English generally allowed the Dutch to retain their property and customs, creating a pluralistic society. To the south, William Penn founded Pennsylvania in 1681 as a holy experiment in religious tolerance and peaceful relations with indigenous peoples. Penn's frame of government, 1682, guaranteed religious freedom and established a representative assembly. His fair treatment of the Lenape, Delaware people, including purchasing land through treaties, created an unusually peaceful frontier, though this peace would not last beyond Penn's lifetime. The evolution of racial slavery. Slavery in the Americas evolved through distinct phases with varying rationales. The earliest Spanish and Portuguese settlers enslaved indigenous peoples, justifying it through the concept of the just war. Those who resisted Christianity could be enslaved. However, catastrophic mortality among indigenous populations and papal bulls, notably Sublimis Deus, 1537, declaring indigenous people capable of receiving Christianity, led to restrictions on native enslavement, though forced labor continued under other names like encomienda and mita. The transition to African slavery was gradual but accelerated in the 17th century. The first recorded Africans in Spanish America arrived as early as 1501. In 1518, King Charles I of Spain authorized the direct importation of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean, initiating the transatlantic slave trade as a large-scale enterprise. The Portuguese, with their established trading posts in West Africa, became the primary suppliers. The English entered the trade later, but eventually dominated it. John Hawkins made 3 slaving voyages in the 1560s, selling Africans in Spanish colonies despite Spain's official prohibition. After 1660, the English developed the triangular trade, manufactured goods from England to Africa, enslaved Africans to the Americas, colonial products, sugar, tobacco back to England. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, held a monopoly until 1698, when the trade was opened to all English merchants. The Middle Passage, anatomy of a horror. The transatlantic journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a horrifying ordeal that typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks, but could extend to 3 months with unfavorable winds. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly in ships' holds, often lying spoon fashion, chained together with minimal food and water. Mortality rates averaged 15 to 20% per voyage, with higher rates during epidemics of dysentery, smallpox, or measles. An estimated 2 million people died during the crossing out of approximately 12.5 million transported. The experience began with capture in Africa, through warfare, kidnapping, or as punishment for crimes, followed by a forced march to coastal forts. At places like Elmina, Ghana, or Gorée Island, Senegal, captives were held in dungeons until ships arrived. Once aboard, they endured unimaginable conditions: inadequate sanitation, minimal nutrition, rampant disease, and brutal discipline. Suicide was common. Some jumped overboard, others refused to eat. Resistance occurred at every stage. The most dramatic form was shipboard revolt, which happened on approximately 10% of voyages. The most famous successful revolt occurred on the Spanish ship La Amistad in 1839, but smaller-scale resistance was constant. Women sometimes used contraception or abortion to prevent bearing children into slavery. Cultural resistance included maintaining African languages, religious practices, and musical traditions. Regional variations in slave systems. Different regions developed distinct slave systems based on their primary crops and demographic patterns. The Caribbean Sugar Islands, the most brutal regime. Enslaved people worked in gangs from sunrise to sunset, with high mortality from overwork, disease, and inadequate nutrition. The average lifespan after arrival was 7 to 10 years. The white population was a small minority living in constant fear of revolt. By 1770, Jamaica had approximately 18,000 whites and 200,000 enslaved Africans. The Chesapeake Tobacco region, less lethal than sugar but still demanding. Chesapeake plantations were smaller, with closer though still oppressive supervision. Natural reproduction eventually supplemented importation, creating a more balanced sex ratio and allowing for family formation, though families could be separated at any time. By the mid-18th century, the enslaved population was growing naturally. The Carolina-Georgia rice coast, rice cultivation used task systems where enslaved people had specific daily assignments. Once tasks were completed, they had time for themselves. This allowed somewhat more autonomy and the development of African-based expertise. Many enslaved people came from rice-growing regions of West Africa and possessed valuable knowledge. Northern colonies. Slavery existed, but on a smaller scale, mostly as domestic servants or skilled artisans. The climate and economy didn't support plantation agriculture. By 1770, enslaved people constituted only about 3% of New England's population. Spanish and Portuguese America. More complex racial hierarchies developed, with numerous categories, castas, based on percentages of European, African, and indigenous ancestry. Manumission was more common, creating large free black populations, particularly in cities. Resistance and rebellion. Enslaved Africans and their descendants resisted bondage in various ways, from daily acts of defiance to organized rebellion. Day-to-day resistance included work slowdowns, feigning illness, breaking tools, and theft. Cultural resistance involved maintaining African traditions in music, religion, and family structures. Running away was common. Some runaways, cimarrones in Spanish, maroons in English, formed communities in inaccessible regions. The most impressive was Palmares in Brazil, a federation of maroon settlements that lasted most of the 17th century and at its height had perhaps 20,000 inhabitants. In Jamaica, maroons fought the British to a standstill and secured treaties in 1739 granting them autonomy. Organized rebellions, while less frequent, haunted slave societies. Major revolts included New York Slave Revolt, 1712. 23 enslaved Africans set fire to buildings and killed 9 whites. 21 were executed, some by burning alive. Stono Rebellion, 1739. South Carolina's largest slave revolt, where approximately 60 enslaved people killed about 25 whites before being defeated. Tacky's Revolt, 1760. A major uprising in Jamaica involving perhaps 1,000 enslaved people. These rebellions led to increasingly harsh slave codes, but demonstrated that slavery was maintained only through constant surveillance and violence. The first intercolonial wars, patterns of conflict. European conflicts inevitably spilled into the Americas, where they took on local characteristics and involved indigenous allies. These wars were both extensions of European politics and independent struggles for control of the continent. King William's War, 1689 to 1697, the American theater of the 9 Years' War, pitted England against France. Frontier settlements from New York to Maine suffered devastating raids by French forces and their Algonquian allies. The most notable event was the 1690 English capture of Port Royal in Acadia, though it was returned at war's end. The war established patterns. French forces, with their indigenous allies, excelled at frontier raiding, La Petite Guerre. The English, with Iroquois support, attacked by sea but struggled in the interior. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, corresponding to the War of Spanish Succession, was more extensive. South Carolina militia and their Yamasee allies attacked Spanish Florida, destroying missions and enslaving thousands of indigenous converts. New England forces again captured Port Royal, renamed Annapolis Royal. The most dramatic event was the 1704 Deerfield Raid in Massachusetts, where French and indigenous forces killed 56 and captured 109 settlers. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, gave Britain Newfoundland, Acadia, and Hudson Bay territory, while confirming its control of St. Kitts. Britain also gained the Asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. King George's War, 1744 to 1748, part of the War of Austrian Succession, saw the most dramatic American action. The 1745 capture of the formidable French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island by New England troops under William Pepperell. However, the peace treaty returned Louisbourg to France, angering colonists who had sacrificed for its capture. The French and Indian War, climax of imperial rivalry. The climactic struggle began in the Ohio Valley, claimed by France, Britain, and various native nations. In 1753, the French began building forts to secure the region. The Virginia governor sent 21-year-old Major George Washington to warn them to leave. In 1754, Washington's skirmish with French forces at Jumonville Glen and subsequent surrender at Fort Necessity sparked open conflict. The early years favored France and its allies. General Edward Braddock's 1755 expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh, ended in disaster, with Braddock killed and his army routed. French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm captured British forts Oswego, 1756, and William Henry, 1757, where the massacre of surrendering troops by France's indigenous allies became infamous propaganda. Britain's fortunes changed when William Pitt became Prime Minister in 1757. He committed massive resources to North America, promising to reimburse colonies for their expenses. British regulars and colonial troops captured Louisbourg, 1758, Fort Duquesne, 1758, and Quebec, 1759, in the dramatic Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where both Montcalm and British General James Wolfe died. Montreal fell in 1760. The Treaty of Paris and its consequences. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, was a decisive victory for Britain. France ceded all territory east of the Mississippi, except New Orleans, and Canada. Spain, which had entered the war late on France's side, ceded Florida to Britain, but received French Louisiana west of the Mississippi as compensation. France's North American empire was effectively finished, retaining only a few Caribbean islands and fishing rights off Newfoundland. The treaty had profound consequences. Britain became the dominant colonial power in North America. The French threat, which had long united the colonies with Britain, was removed. Britain acquired massive new territories with diverse populations, French Canadians, Spanish Floridians, numerous indigenous nations. Britain's national debt doubled to approximately £137 million. Pontiac's War and the Proclamation of 1763. The removal of the French created a crisis for native peoples in the interior, who had used the balance between European powers to maintain autonomy. British policies under General Geoffrey Amherst, cutting off the traditional gift-giving that signified alliance, allowing settlement on indigenous lands, and stationing troops in former French posts, angered many tribes. In 1763, an Ottawa leader named Pontiac, inspired by the teachings of the Delaware prophet Neolin, who preached rejection of European goods and ways, organized a broad coalition that captured 8 British forts and besieged Detroit and Fort Pitt. The conflict revealed British vulnerability and indigenous power. Amherst suggested distributing smallpox-infected blankets to Indians, an early instance of biological warfare that may have been implemented at Fort Pitt. The British government, seeking to avoid further expensive conflict, issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. reserving that territory for indigenous peoples. This angered colonists and speculators who had fought for that very land, creating one of the first major tensions between Britain and its American subjects. The proclamation was largely ignored by settlers moving west, but it established the principle of royal control over westward expansion. Demographic transformation and diversity. Between 1700 and 1770, the colonial population grew from about 250,000 to over 2.5 million through natural increase and immigration. High birth rates, the average colonial woman had 7 to 8 children, and lower mortality than in Europe contributed to rapid growth. Immigration diversified the population. Africans. By 1770, approximately 20% of the colonial population was of African descent, with concentrations over 40% in Virginia and over 90% in some Caribbean islands. Germans. Beginning in the 1680s, large numbers of Germans, particularly from the Palatinate, arrived, settling mostly in Pennsylvania and the southern backcountry. Scots-Irish. Protestants from Northern Ireland began arriving in the early 18th century, often moving to the frontier where they clashed with indigenous peoples. Other groups, smaller numbers of French Huguenots, Swiss, Welsh and Jews added to the diversity. Colonial cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, remained small by European standards. Philadelphia, the largest, had about 30,000 people in 1776, but were important commercial and cultural centers. They developed sophisticated institutions, newspapers, Boston's public occurrences in 1690, though suppressed after one issue. The Boston Newsletter in 1704 was more successful. Libraries, colleges, Harvard 1636, William and Mary 1693, Yale 1701, and philosophical societies. The Enlightenment in America. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, natural law, and progress, influenced educated colonists through books and correspondence with Europe. Key Enlightenment ideas that took root in America included natural rights, the concept that certain rights, life, liberty, property, were inherent and could not be legitimately taken away by government. Social contract, the idea that government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Separation of powers, the division of government into executive, legislative, and judicial branches to prevent tyranny. Benjamin Franklin epitomized the American Enlightenment, a self-made man who rose from printer's apprentice to scientist, inventor, diplomat, and political thinker. His experiments with electricity brought him international fame. His Poor Richard's Almanac, 1732 to 1758, disseminated practical wisdom and Enlightenment values. Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society, 1743, to promote useful knowledge. Other influential Enlightenment figures included John Locke. His two treatises of government, 1689, profoundly influenced American political thought, particularly the concepts of natural rights and government by consent. Montesquieu, his The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, advocated separation of powers, influencing the design of American governments. Thomas Jefferson, an avid reader of Enlightenment thinkers who would articulate their principles in the Declaration of Independence. The First Great Awakening, religious ferment. The First Great Awakening, 1730s to 1740s, was a transatlantic evangelical revival that emphasized emotional conversion, personal faith, and the authority of the Bible over established clergy. Key features included itinerant preaching. Evangelists like George Whitefield traveled throughout the colonies, drawing enormous crowds with their theatrical style. Emotionalism. Services featured dramatic conversions, weeping and fainting, a contrast to formal intellectual Puritan services. Lay participation. The awakening challenged clerical authority, encouraging ordinary people to interpret Scripture for themselves. Egalitarianism. The message that all people were equal before God challenged social hierarchies. The awakening had profound social and political consequences. It split denominations between new lights, revivalists, and old lights, traditionalists. It encouraged individualism and challenged authority, attitudes that would later support revolutionary sentiment. It created networks of evangelicals across colony lines, fostering a sense of shared American identity. It led to the founding of new colleges to train evangelical ministers: Princeton, 1746, Brown, 1764, Rutgers, 1766, and Dartmouth, 1769. Economic development and tensions with Britain. The colonial economy grew increasingly sophisticated and increasingly at odds with British mercantilist policy. Mercantilism held that colonies existed to benefit the mother country by supplying raw materials and consuming manufactured goods. The Navigation Acts, beginning in 1651, mandated that colonial trade be conducted in English ships and that certain enumerated goods, tobacco, sugar, cotton, etc., be shipped only to England or other English colonies. Colonists found ways around these restrictions through widespread smuggling. Colonial merchants traded directly with foreign colonies despite Navigation Acts. Colonial manufacturing, particularly of iron, woolens and hats, competed with British goods. The Molasses Act of 1733, which placed prohibitive duties on foreign molasses, was widely ignored by New England rum producers. Regional economies became more specialized. New England, shipping, fishing, shipbuilding, whale products. Middle colonies, grain, flour, iron, livestock. New York and Philadelphia became the breadbaskets of the Atlantic. Upper South, tobacco, wheat. Lower South, rice, indigo, later cotton. Caribbean, sugar, molasses, rum. Wealth distribution was highly unequal, especially in plantation areas. The top 10% of wealth holders in Boston and Philadelphia owned about 60% of the wealth. In Charleston, over 70%. Yet social mobility was greater than in Europe, and a broad, middling sort of artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers enjoyed comfortable standards of living. The post-war imperial crisis. Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War with a massive national debt and new territories to administer. The British government believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense and administration. Americans believed they had contributed through military service and that their traditional rights as Englishmen were being violated. The Sugar Act, 1764, also known as the Revenue Act, reduced the duty on foreign molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, but aimed to collect it rigorously through strengthened vice admiralty courts, which operated without juries. More importantly, it established the principle that Parliament could tax the colonies for revenue, not just to regulate trade. The Stamp Act, 1765, was the first direct internal tax on the colonies, requiring revenue stamps on all paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, licenses, even playing cards. It provoked unprecedented resistance. Patrick Henry introduced the Virginia Resolves, asserting that Virginians possessed all the liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities that have at any time been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the people of Great Britain. The Stamp Act Congress, October 1765, brought together delegates from 9 colonies, asserting that only their own elected assemblies could tax them. Sons of Liberty groups used intimidation against stamp distributors. Tarring and feathering became a favoured tactic. A colonial boycott of British goods was so effective that Parliament repealed the Act in 1766, but passed the Declaratory Act asserting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, escalating tensions and the slide toward conflict. The Townshend Acts, 1767, placed duties on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania argued that external taxes for revenue, as opposed to trade regulation, were also unconstitutional. colonial boycotts resumed, with women playing key roles in producing homespun cloth as alternatives to British textiles. In response to growing unrest, Britain sent troops to Boston, leading to the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. A confrontation between a snowball-throwing mob and British soldiers ended with the soldiers firing, killing 5 colonists, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, which exaggerated the brutality, became powerful propaganda. Following the repeal of most townshend duties, except on tea, retained to assert Parliament's authority, a period of relative calm lasted until 1773. The Tea Act gave the financially struggling East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. Colonists saw this as a subtle way to establish Parliament's taxing authority and undermine colonial merchants. On December 16, 1773, radicals disguised as Mohawks dumped 342 chests of tea, worth about £10,000, into Boston Harbor. The Coercive Acts and colonial unity. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, called Intolerable Acts by colonists. Boston Port Act closed Boston's harbor until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts Government Act altered the colony's charter, giving the royal governor more power and restricting town meetings. Administration of Justice Act allowed trials of officials to be moved to Britain. Quartering Act mandated housing for British troops in private homes. The Quebec Act passed around the same time, extending Quebec's boundaries south to the Ohio River and recognizing Catholicism, was seen by colonists as part of this oppressive package, especially by New England Protestants who feared popery. Colonies rallied to Massachusetts's support. The First Continental Congress, September to October 1774, convened in Philadelphia, with 56 delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia absent. It endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, declaring the Coercive Acts unconstitutional, established the Continental Association to enforce a boycott of British goods, and petitioned the king for redress. Militias began training. British General Thomas Gage, now governor of Massachusetts, was ordered to suppress the rebellion. Lexington, Concord, and the Decision for Independence, on April 18, 1775, Gage sent troops to Concord to seize colonial military supplies. Riders, including Paul Revere and William Dawes, alerted the countryside. The next morning, British regulars confronted about 70 Minutemen on Lexington Green. Someone fired the shot heard round the world. 8 Americans died. At Concord, after destroying some supplies, the British faced growing resistance on their return to Boston, suffering about 300 casualties. The Second Continental Congress assumed the role of national government, creating the Continental Army with George Washington as commander-in-chief. The Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775, showed colonial forces could stand against regulars, though they ultimately lost the position. An olive branch petition was sent to the king in July 1775, but George III refused to receive it, declaring the colonies in rebellion. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, January 1776, argued persuasively for complete independence, attacking monarchy itself. Government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in its worst state an intolerable one, and presenting the cause as one of universal human rights. It sold over 100,000 copies in 3 months, fundamentally shifting public opinion. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin drafted the Declaration of Independence, which Congress adopted on July 4, 1776. Jefferson's eloquent preamble articulated revolutionary principles: natural rights, government by consent, and the right of revolution. The list of grievances against George III justified the break. Diversity of indigenous societies. Pre-Columbian North America was home to an estimated 5 to 10 million people speaking hundreds of distinct languages and organized into diverse societies. Northeast Woodlands, Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, later Tuscarora, Algonquian-speaking peoples, Lenape, Powhatan, Wampanoag, Pequot, Narragansett. Southeast, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, the 5 civilized tribes. Great Plains, nomadic bison hunters, Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and semi-sedentary agriculturalists, Pawnee, Mandan. Southwest, Pueblo peoples, Hopi, Zuni, Apache, Navajo. Pacific Coast, complex hunter-gatherer societies with sophisticated art and social stratification. These societies had sophisticated political systems, agricultural practices, the 3 sisters, corn, beans, squash, trade networks, and spiritual beliefs. European colonization would challenge all these aspects, patterns of interaction and adaptation. Indigenous responses to European arrival varied widely based on local circumstances. The Spanish borderlands, in Florida, New Mexico, Texas, and California, Spanish colonization combined military presidios, forts, Catholic missions, and civilian settlements. The mission system aimed to congregate natives into controlled communities, reducciones, for conversion and labor. This often led to cultural suppression and high mortality from disease. Revolts were frequent, most famously the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in New Mexico, led by Pope, which successfully expelled the Spanish for 12 years, the most significant victory for Native Americans in North America. New France. French interaction was primarily through trade and alliance. The French needed native partners as hunters, trappers, and military allies. Intermarriage was common, giving rise to a distinct Métis population. This system required a degree of mutual accommodation, though it was still predicated on French economic and strategic dominance. New England. The Puritan vision was of a closed agrarian community of saints. While initial trade and aid from tribes like the Wampanoag were crucial for survival, exemplified by the 1621 harvest feast, later mythologized as the first Thanksgiving, the English need for farmland led to direct permanent displacement. Land was purchased through treaties of often dubious fairness, but the fundamental incompatibility was existential. English settlers wanted to own and improve the land for farming. Many native societies practiced a mix of agriculture, hunting, and foraging across territories. The Chesapeake and Southeast. In Virginia, the pattern was one of initial trade, followed by land encroachment and warfare. In the Carolinas, founded 1663, the colony's economy was based on the Indian slave trade for decades, with English-backed Creek and Cherokee raiders enslaving tens of thousands of people from other tribes, like the Appalachee, for sale to Caribbean plantations. This weaponized indigenous rivalries on a massive scale. The Dutch and the Iroquois, the Dutch at New Amsterdam and Fort Orange, were purely commercial. Their most significant impact was arming the Iroquois Confederacy with firearms in exchange for furs. With these weapons, the Iroquois waged the Beaver Wars against the Huron and other French allies to the north and west, seeking to control the fur trade. They became a dominant military and diplomatic power in the northeast, playing European empires against each other, the demographic catastrophe and cultural exchange. The single greatest impact on indigenous populations was disease. Lacking immunity to pathogens endemic in Europe, Africa, and Asia, Native Americans were devastated by successive epidemics of smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus. These diseases spread along trade routes, often far in advance of European settlement. Mortality rates in initial epidemics could reach 90% in some communities. The Columbian exchange was not one-sided. Indigenous peoples introduced Europeans to food crops, maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, peanuts, tobacco, and many varieties of beans and squash. Agricultural techniques, controlled burning, companion planting. Medicines, quinine for malaria, coca, various herbal remedies. Transportation, canoes, snowshoes, toboggans. Political concepts. Some scholars argue the Iroquois Confederacy influenced American ideas of federalism. Indigenous peoples selectively adopted European technologies, metal tools and cooking utensils, firearms, wool blankets, and glass beads. Horses, reintroduced by the Spanish, transformed plains cultures, enabling bison hunting on a larger scale and more mobile warfare. The world they made, transformative impacts. The European colonization of the Americas from 1492 to 1776 created a new world in both literal and figurative senses. The collision of hemispheres initiated processes that transformed global ecology, demography, economics, and politics. The Columbian Exchange, the transference of plants, animals, diseases, and people between hemispheres created what historian Alfred Crosby called ecological imperialism. American crops like potatoes and maize boosted European and Asian populations. Old World livestock, cattle, pigs, horses, transformed American landscapes. Disease devastated indigenous populations while facilitating European takeover. Global economic integration, silver from Spanish America flowed to Europe and then to Asia to pay for spices, silks, and porcelain, creating the first truly global economy. The plantation complex, based on enslaved African labor, produced sugar, tobacco, and other commodities for growing European consumer markets, fueling the development of capitalism. Demographic transformation. The Americas were repopulated through a tragic triad: the catastrophic decline of indigenous peoples, the voluntary and forced migration of millions of Europeans, and the brutal forced migration of millions of Africans. This created the multi-ethnic societies of the modern Western Hemisphere. Intellectual and political innovation. European colonies, particularly in British North America, became laboratories for new political ideas. Distance from Europe fostered traditions of self-government. Enlightenment principles combined with colonial experience to produce revolutionary ideology. The United States would become the first modern republic founded on Enlightenment principles, inspiring revolutions worldwide. Contradictory legacies. The colonial period bequeathed contradictory legacies that would shape American history: liberty and slavery. The same revolutionary generation that declared all men are created equal included slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. The contradiction between ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery would haunt the new nation, leading eventually to civil war. Expansion and dispossession. The westward movement, celebrated as manifest destiny, meant the displacement and destruction of indigenous nations. The proclamation of 1763's attempt to limit expansion was rejected by colonists, establishing a pattern of ignoring treaties and indigenous rights. Religious freedom and intolerance. Colonies founded as havens for religious dissenters often became intolerant of other faiths. The principle of religious freedom emerged gradually through painful experience. Local self-government and imperial control. Colonial assemblies' struggle against royal authority established traditions of representative government, but also bred suspicion of centralized power that would complicate the creation of an effective federal government. The end of the First British Empire. The American Revolution did not end European colonialism in the Americas. British, French, Spanish, and Portuguese possessions remained, but it marked a turning point. The age of European discovery and conquest was giving way to the age of revolution and independence, a process that would continue through the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, and the Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century. The colonization of the Americas fundamentally reshaped the world. It shifted economic power toward the Atlantic, created new patterns of global trade, stimulated the development of capitalism, and planted the seeds of modern democratic ideals alongside the poison of racial inequality. This dual legacy of liberty and oppression, opportunity and exploitation would define not only American history, but much of modern world history. As the delegates signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, they were concluding one chapter, nearly 3 centuries of European colonization, and beginning another, the struggle to create a nation based on revolutionary principles in a world still dominated by empires. The success of that experiment was far from certain, but its launching marked the end of the colonial era and the beginning of a new epoch in the history of the Americas and the world. And so, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, nearly 3 centuries of European colonization reached a dramatic turning point. The age of conquest and settlement was giving way to the age of revolution. The colonial era left a profound and contradictory legacy: ideals of liberty born alongside systems of slavery, new societies forged through cultural exchange and devastating conflict, and economies that tied the world together through both innovation and exploitation. The American Revolution did not end colonialism in the Americas, but it ignited a flame of independence that would eventually spread across 2 continents. The world created between 1492 and 1776, with all its promise and paradox, would shape the modern era, setting the stage for the nations, struggles and ideals that define our world today. The colonial chapter had closed. The revolutionary age had begun. If you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment, like and subscribe. Perhaps since you made it this far, check out what would have happened to Europe if US would have left NATO. Until next time.